We're All Right by Marshmallow Fairies. Chapter 16. An Explanation and a Mishap. Tony Stark may have been a genius, but he was struggling to wrap his mind around the sight before him. It had all begun a few weeks ago, when Peter had begun asking questions about time travel. Tony had explained some of the theory to the kid, but Peter wanted to know everything from the very beginning. He wanted to understand how the Avengers that had remained had come up with the idea, what they had theorized, and how they had tested it. Although Tony knew most of the details, he hadn't been there for the whole process, having initially turned down their request for help. So he spoke to Bruce and Scott, arranging for them all to come meet at the compound one weekend where they could give the teenager a very thorough explanation and show him the equipment and technology they had used to pull off the time heist. Scott and Peter had been like two excited puppies, with Scott opening the back of his van to reveal the quantum tunnel installed in the back. "Whoa!" Peter had exclaimed, edging closer and peering inside. "Careful, Pete!" Tony had called, itching to grab the kid by the back of his shirt and yank him back, but instead of hanging back beside Bruce to avoid being accused of overprotectiveness. Scott stepped closer to the two other adults, grinning. "Pretty cool, huh?" the size-altering hero called. "So, when we use it," he began explaining, holding up one of the suits they had worn for the time heist, "we wear one of these suits with the particles stored here to use when we enter and exit the quantum realm." Peter tilted his head to the side. "The PIM particles, right?" he questioned. "Yeah," Scott confirmed. "Look." He tossed a vial containing the particle to Peter, who caught it easily and held it as close to his face as he examined it. "Whoa!" he said, quieter this time. Then, in a flash, the kid had disappeared, and moments later, in his place, sat a baby wearing his clothes. There was a moment of silence before Tony exploded. "What the hell just happened?" Bruce frowned, staring at the controls in front of him. I tapped one of the buttons, but it shouldn't have started the tunnel up," the scientist said. "Even if it did, Peter didn't activate the particles, so I don't understand." "Well, fix it!" Tony shouted desperately. "He wasn't even in the suit," Scott muttered in disbelief, staring at the infant on the floor in oversized clothing. "Bruce!" Tony snapped. "Right," Bruce muttered. Scott, give him another particle." Scott turned towards the two geniuses, eyes wide and face pale. "Lang?" Tony pressed. "I only brought one with me," he admitted. As he watched Bruce's face fall and Tony's darken, he held up his hands defensively. "You said we wouldn't be doing any practical demonstrations. How was I supposed to know? What are we gonna do? Peter is Tony's rant was cut off by a small cry, and all three men turned their attention back to the infant on the floor, staring back up at them with big, babby eyes and a wobbling lip. "Pete," Tony called out softly, stepping around Scott and closer to the baby, who instantly reached his little arms up, making a grabbing motion with his hands. The billionaire crouched, lifting the child and quickly wrapping the t-shirt that was sliding off, wrapping it around the infant like a blanket. I'll go and call Hank," Scott said, backing away before jogging to the door. Bruce stared wide-eyed as he shut off the machine, watching in fascination as Tony gently bounced the infant in his arms. "Dada?" a small voice whimpered, and Tony instantly shushed him. "It's okay," the genius cooed. "You're okay. I've got you." Abruptly, the man turned back towards Bruce. "Should you check him over?" "Don't you think that would be a little intimidating for him?" Bruce asked. Tony frowned. "Why would he be intimidated? He knows you." "It looks as though he's not even a year old, and he just called you Dada." Bruce tossed back. "He won't remember." "Bruce!" Both men glanced down at the child, who was peering out from Tony's chest, wide eyes on the large green man and a big smile on his face. Tony smirked while Bruce frowned. "Then why did he call you?" Bruce began, trailing off uncertainly. It's a fairly real development, Tony murmured, dipping his head down so that his nose touched Peter's curls. Scott bounded back into the room, phone still in hand. Okay, he began. Hank's not happy, but he's going to give us some particles. Great, how quickly can he get here? Tony asked. Well, I have to go to him, Scott muttered. Tony opened his mouth to protest, but Scott continued. He's in Manhattan. I'll be as quick as I can. Without waiting for a reply, the hero ran to the back of his van, closing the doors and hurrying around to the driver's side door. Meanwhile, Tony felt a sudden warmth against his front and heard the sound of running water. He glanced down at Peter, whose eyes were once again welling up, and sighed. Friday? Get Hogan on the line. Tony left Peter with a reluctant Bruce, while he jumped into the shower and found fresh clothes for himself. After reattaching his prosthetic arm, he emerged from the bathroom and entered his bedroom, only to feel his heart stop. Bruce was gazing up at the ceiling, where Peter was happily crawling around. What are you doing? Tony hissed, trying desperately to remain calm and not startle the infant. It's fascinating, Bruce muttered, eyes never leaving Peter. Even though his body has regressed into a former state, the time travel couldn't undo the genetic mutation, so he has retained his powers. Tony gaped. This isn't a time for scientific study, he muttered. Then louder, he called, Pete, come on, kiddo. Down you come. Peter's face lit up when he saw Tony, and he released his hold on the ceiling, Bruce quickly throwing his arms underneath to catch the child, before handing him over to the billionaire. Tony glared at his friend before laying Peter on top of the bed, ensuring that the towel he had pinned around the child as a makeshift diaper was still clean and securely in place. The child squirmed unhappily at the lack of contact, and Tony smirked before leaning down and blowing raspberries against his tummy. Peter's belly laugh was adorable, and Tony gave him a fond smile before picking the child up and holding him close to his chest again. He turned to find Bruce watching with a smile on his face. What? He questioned. Nothing, Bruce replied. You're just very good at this. Tony smiled but said nothing, breezing past Bruce and heading to the Avengers Lounge. He had expected to find it empty. Sam, Steve and Bucky had gone on some road trip. Rhodey was working in Washington. Thor was in Asgard, and he thought Clint had taken both Wanda and Natasha to his farm for the weekend. However, when he entered the room, Natasha was sat on the couch reading a book, which she put down when coming in with Bruce following close behind. What's going on? The spy asked. I thought you and the boys were having a nerd fest downstairs with the kid. She tilted her head in confusion when she spotted the baby in Tony's arms. Where did the baby come from? Before either man could answer, the child spotted the woman and squealed, Dash! Natasha frowned, eyes flickering from both the men to the baby. Is that Peter? Dash! He shouted again, squirming and reaching his hands towards her. The redhead smiled, approaching, and reaching her own hands out to take him. Tony resisted for a moment before reluctantly handing him over. Hello, Spider Baby, she cooed as he reached for her hair before turning her attention to the two men. What happened? Why have you left him like this? A series of errors, Tony muttered. Lang is meeting Hank Pym to get more particles. Until then, Peter is stuck like this. Natasha frowned at the infant in her arms, who had stuck his hand into her hair and was waving it around, then back to the two men before her. That could take a few hours. We don't have the supplies for a baby, even one for that short amount of time. As if on cue, Friday spoke up. Boss, Mr. Hogan has arrived. Send him up, Fry, Tony instructed, moving towards Natasha and taking Peter back into his own arms. The child's stickiness relented as he transferred back to his father figure's hold. What about you? He asked. I thought you were visiting Clint's place for the weekend. Fury called me in for a meeting on Friday afternoon, so I told him to go without me. She replied casually, giving Tony a calculating look as he adjusted his hold on Peter, wondering why he had taken him back from her so quickly. Before she could voice her question, the elevator doors opened and Happy strode into the room, carrying several shopping bags. Boss, why did you make me go buy baby stuff? Morgan's past all this, the man grumbled. Then he glanced around the room. Where's the kid? I thought he was with you this weekend. Tony frowned. How did you know the kid was with me? Happy's cheeks flushed as he began. Well, I... Happy! The little voice chimed in and Happy's gaze was drawn to the baby in his boss's arms, whose pudgy little arms waved back and forth in what was clearly supposed to be a wave. The head of security frowned. How does that baby, know my name? The three Avengers shared uneasy glances before Bruce finally spoke up. There was a slight mishap. Happy's eyes widened, landing on Tony. Tell me that's not Peter, he said. When Tony only grimaced in response, he went on. What have you told his aunt? We haven't, and we won't have to, Tony answered. We'll have him back to normal by the end of the day. Happy snorted. And what am I supposed to tell her, huh? Natasha joined in the conversation for the first time. Why would you have to tell her anything? She asked, but there was a knowing look on her face. As Happy opened and closed his mouth several times, looking like a goldfish, a grin grew slowly on Tony's face. Happy, you dark horse, he drawled. Are you going on a date with Aunt Hottie? Before the man could confirm or deny, there was a whimper, and all four adult eyes turned to the infant who was gazing back at Happy with wide, Bambi eyes, lower lip wobbling. Tony quickly turned the child around and pressed his face into his shoulder. Now look what you've done, Tony admonished with a smirk on his face. You upset the spider baby. Happy dumped the shopping bags on the kitchen worktop and began backing away towards the elevator. I gotta go, he muttered, his eyes never leaving the whimpering child. You'd better fix this, Tony. And with that, the elevator doors closed, leaving 3 amused Avengers and 1 distressed baby. Tony gently bounced Peter in his arms, making his way over to the abandoned shopping. All right, Spider Baby, let's get you dressed, he murmured. Once Peter was dressed, fed, and worn out from playing, he was soon sound asleep, cradled in Tony's arms. Both Bruce and Natasha watched their friend with amused smiles. None of the Avengers would have imagined Tony Stark to be like this when they had first met, but he looked so comfortable. You can put him down, you know, Natasha said with a smirk. He's not going to disappear. Tony flinched, and Peter's face scrunched up as he admitted a small whine. Only once the billionaire had gently shushed him and settled him down once more, did Tony glance up to throw a glare at the spy. Sorry, she muttered. That was poor word choice. Tony grunted in acknowledgement, before turning his attention once more to the tiny human he held. Peter was absolutely perfect. Seriously, Tony, Bruce tried. Did you do this with Morgan? We can't arrange pillows so that he won't fall. No, I know. It's just... Tony began, but cut himself off abruptly, unwilling to admit the range of emotions he was experiencing. But he should have known that his friends wouldn't let him off that easily. Just what, Tony? Natasha pressed. Tony sighed, but kept his eyes on Peter. Seeing Pete like this, it just reminds me of Morgan. He paused, but he could feel their eyes on him. His comrades were waiting for him for more, so he continued. When Morgan came along, I was so happy. I don't think I've ever been that happy, actually, but it was also heartbreaking because Peter should have been there. The genius chanced a glance at his 2 friends, noting how they were no longer smiling. He knew he could stop there, but now he had opened the gate, he felt obliged to continue. There wasn't a moment where I didn't imagine how great he would be with her, you know? How much he would love her. You can see it now, though, Tony, Bruce said, He loves Morgan. He would do anything for her. Tony couldn't help the snort he let out. Yeah, I think he's proved that, he muttered sarcastically, trying to ignore the twist in his stomach that he still felt any time he thought about that disastrous attempt to visit the ice cream parlour. The image of his kid lying on the road, broken and bleeding. Bruce huffed a quiet laugh to himself. Exactly, the scientist muttered. He may have missed the first few years, but he's there now. And he's loving every moment of being a part of the Stark family. You get to enjoy them both, Tony. Tony only nodded, his eyes still glued to Peter's face, as the infant snuggled closer into his chest. Before Natasha spoke up, ever perceptive. There's more, she murmured. Tony sighed, taking only a moment before he shared the thoughts that had been plaguing him, thoughts he wouldn't even share with Pepper. Every moment with Morgan, even now, is a reminder that I missed all those moments with Peter, he admitted quietly, unsure if saying the words out loud made him feel better or worse. I was there for all of Morgan's firsts. First steps. First words. I wasn't there for any of Pete's. Natasha frowned. Of course you weren't there. You didn't know him until he was a teenager. I know, Tony said with a sigh. God, I wish I had been there. Natasha and Bruce shared uneasy glances, while Tony's focus remained on the infant in his arms. He had requested Friday take photos throughout the day, but he couldn't get enough of the real thing. It was Bruce who finally broke the silence. Tony, the scientist began uncertainly. You can't leave him like this. Tony! Natasha said reproachfully, and Tony's head snapped up. Of course, I'm not going to leave him like this. I would never do that to Peter. He bit back defensively. Then he glanced down again and quietly added, besides, I would ruin him. Natasha stood, walking across the room to join Tony on the couch. Tony, Morgan is a wonderful little girl, who you helped to raise. It is safe to say you wouldn't ruin Peter, Natasha told him, placing a hand on Tony's prosthetic arm. Though he wouldn't be the Peter you love now, if he hadn't lived the life he has, she added, and that life included meeting you when he did. Tony blinked back tears as he thought over his friend's words. He wasn't sure if he believed in fate, but maybe he and Peter had met at a time in their lives when they had most needed each other. The genius leaned down, gently kissing the baby's forehead, and then watching with a swelling in his chest as Peter began to stir. Boss, Mr. Lang has returned, Friday announced. Tony could safely say that his anxiety levels were right up with reversing Thanos' snap, flying a nuke into the wormhole, and seeing Peter trying to hold a fairy together. He had just placed Peter in front of the tunnel once again, this time in a pair of oversized boxers and one of the suits that the team had worn for the time heist. He turned to Bruce, who asked, Are you ready? Tony swallowed and nodded, before turning his attention back to Peter, who gazed back at him from behind his helmet, eyes wide and heartbreakingly wet. Bruce fired up the tunnel, and with a flash, the infant Peter disappeared and a larger figure stood in his place. Did it work? Scott asked hesitantly. He had spare particles this time, but he wanted to use as few as possible. The more they had to use, the more he was likely to face the wrath of Tony and Hank. Peter? Tony called out uncertainly, taking a tentative step forward. Dad? A familiar voice called back, and the figure tore off their helmet, revealing curly hair in disarray and wide brown eyes. Am I me? Tony huffed out a laugh. Bruce! Shut it down, the genius called out, and then stepped around the equipment, enveloping his kid in a hug. Dad? Peter repeated, arms coming up to loosely return the hug, but there was still uncertainty in his voice. Yeah, you're you, Underoos, Tony murmured into the kid's ears again. You're my favourite 17-year-old again. Peter laughed, finally putting some energy into the hug before pulling away. What happened? I mean, I know what happened, but how did it happen? Bruce laughed nervously, and Tony turned to glare at him. We're not entirely sure, Bruce admitted. So we're going to steer clear of the equipment for the rest of the explanation. No more science tonight, Tony said. We'll go into the theory tomorrow. Today has been eventful enough. Yeah, I'm beat, Scott chimed in, and when all eyes turned to him, he quirked an eyebrow. What? It was a long drive. Peter laughed before turning. His eyes widened and his face reddened. Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. For what? Tony asked. Peter's face blushed even deeper and he muttered, I peed on you. Tony snorted, throwing an arm around Peter's shoulders. Don't worry about it, kid. Morgan has done worse. One time she projectile vomited all over Happy's suit. His face was redder than my Iron Man suits. At the mention of the head of security, Peter frowned. Wait, Happy and May? He asked. Tony sobered up immediately, searching Peter's face. Yeah, you didn't seem too cool with that. You didn't know? No, Peter replied, shaking his head. I mean, I'm fine with it. I think he's really good for her, but it's weird. Tony chuckled as Peter wrinkled his nose at the thought of the pair dating and began steering the teen towards the elevator, leaving Scott and Bruce to sort out the equipment. Well, seeing as you're only wearing underwear under that, how about we get the spider baby dressed and order some food? He suggested. I'm not a spider baby, Peter muttered, cheeks flushed. They stepped into the elevator, and Tony leaned down, kissing Peter's hair. You'll always be my spider baby, he muttered. Dad! End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that because I certainly did. Baby Peter is so flippin' cute. That's adorable. And I love how he was still Peter. He wasn't just a baby, and it was just so sweet. Also, his reaction in baby form of Happy and May, that's hilarious. And also that lovely little heartfelt bit between Bruce, Natasha, and Tony about Peter and him being there for him as a baby. That's so sweet. I have a bit of a weakness for cute things. I'm a sap, okay? I'm a sap. I think by this point you can probably tell. Anyway, remember to like, comment and subscribe. Hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. And have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you are in. Bye my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!